This is Frankie Lynch, Saturn Girl. Like this video, subscribe to my channel, and comment below. I want to know what you think, and it helps out with the algorithm. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about Pluto retrograde going back into Capricorn. He just went retrograde back into Capricorn a few days ago. Well, what does this mean? When a planet goes retrograde back into a sign, it often indicates that they have unfinished business there. Now, you're probably asking, what the heck is even a retrograde, Frankie? Well, let me explain really quickly. Retrograde motion is the apparent motion as seen from Earth, where planets appear to move backwards in the night sky. This would be something observed over multiple days. The planets would still rise and set the same way. If you were observing them, though, then over multiple days, you would notice that they did appear to move backwards through the zodiac. Now, we know planets don't actually move backwards. They all orbit the sun in the same direction, but at different speeds. So imagine this. I'm going to try my best. Let's imagine the TV screen behind me is the sun, and this pink ball is Mercury, and this 8 ball is Earth. Yeah? So the Earth here and Mercury's closer to the sun than Earth is, isn't it? That's called an inferior planet. When an inferior planet, right, notice the Earth is orbiting, but Mercury is orbiting faster. As Mercury approaches the Earth and overtakes its orbit, he appears to move backwards. As he passes the Earth, then he appears to go direct again. For superior planets, that is, planets that are further from the sun than Earth, let me get another guy here. So let's say this is Pluto, right? Obviously, Pluto's much further away, but just for the sake of argument. So Earth is closer to the sun than Pluto. Pluto moves much slower. So as the Earth overtakes him, then Pluto appears to move backwards. Just apparent motion. And as the Earth overtakes him, then Pluto will appear to go direct again. I hope that makes sense. I have a whole nother video where I show some video about how this works. So I hope this makes sense. Superior planets are further, right, from the Earth, from the sun than Earth is, and inferior planets are closer to the sun than Earth is. So what this means symbolically, though, is we often have to readdress questions of corruption, of power and governance and structure, because Pluto is power. And Capricorn is a Saturnian sign. It represents structure and established power in many ways. So we saw Pluto leave Capricorn and enter Aquarius, which has all sorts of amazing implications, and I've made other videos about that. But going retrograde back into Capricorn indicates that there are issues that are still left to be addressed around corruption, power, governance. These have personal implications and more macrocosmic implications. I mean, it's quite fitting that we're seeing, it's the first time we're seeing a former president being criminally indicted. And the charges are quite grave. We're not going to get into all the specifics, but that is a very Pluto retrograde sort of occurrence. During Pluto retrogrades, power is challenged. When Pluto goes back into Capricorn retrograde, and the last time this happened was 248 years ago, just about. The last time Pluto went into Aquarius was 1778. And we saw that during the American and French revolutions. That's another video for another time. But you can see indications of how this sort of transit manifests. So, what else? Well, we could see challenges to incumbent Democrat Joe Biden. He's assumed, as most incumbent presidents are, to be his party's nominee for president. However, 80% of Democratic primary voters want Biden to debate Marianne Williamson, my mama. And RFK Jr. I don't want to hear about RFK Jr. I don't know why people like him. I think it's just his name. I'm not going to get into that. Marianne Williamson. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about the history of this aspect. What I noticed is it follows a lot of nuclear news, right? Well, it's quite fitting also that Pluto was discovered in 1930 and sort of ushered in the atomic age in many ways. Well, in fact, it was January 18th of 1942, while Pluto was retrograde, not in Capricorn, obviously, but retrograde, that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the time of the United States, approved the creation of an atomic bomb. And this would challenge the balance of world power and eventually propel the United States into the position of world power, essentially. That's why the Security Council for the United Nations was created. It was for countries that had the bomb. And it was a very momentous thing. Obviously, it changed the world forever. And now we're entering a phase where Pluto is retrograding Capricorn. And we're facing, rather than the propelling of hegemonic power, we're watching the decline. And again, we don't need to get too far into that. I talk about that quite a bit in my Pluto entering Aquarius video. But suffice it to say that we do see this with big challenges to power. Now, another incident of this was in the 1970s. In May 1972, it was really 1972 to 1973. But while Pluto was retrograde, the United States did many nuclear tests, a whole series of nuclear tests. Another occurrence I found was April of 2006. The Iranian president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad announced that Iran had successfully enriched uranium, which was sort of distressing. That was distressing news at the time. But anyway, I'm not going to get into the politics of it all because there are many arguments in many ways for how these things work out. Well, another challenge to power that I found, late November 1944, the Nazi leadership realized that the Soviets were closing in on Berlin. They knew their days were numbered, and they wanted to hide all their unspeakable crimes. I don't want to get in trouble with YouTube, so we won't go into details. But hopefully you know a little bit about the Holocaust, because every human should know about it. Because every so often, history witnesses the rising up of these forces once again, the forces of hatred and evil. Anyway, the Nazis knew their days were numbered. So, to hide their crimes, Heinrich Himmler ordered the destruction of the crematoria at Auschwitz and another location as well. I can't remember, but again, it was to try and conceal the horror that they had brought upon the world. Well, what does this mean for you? Right? Well, when people say Pluto is transformation, what they really mean is life-shattering crisis. Right? Because how else do we transform? We transform by being smashed. How do you make a diamond? Lots of heat and pressure, my precious. Right? So, the way I describe the Plutonian process Have you seen Terminator 2? I hope you have. I mean, if you're like an elder millennial like me. So there was this character, this other robot named the T-1000, and this robot is made out of liquid metal. And so at one part in the movie, spoiler alert, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Eddie Furlong freeze this character, homeboy. And then they smash him into a million pieces. They freeze him with liquid nitrogen, right? And then, well, then he melts and slowly comes back together. This is the Pluto experience, you see. We are smashed at some point in life through a crisis, a shattering crisis. And then we have to put ourselves back together. And we're never the same. But it's not like we're not still us. But layers have been ripped off of the onion, you see. Bits of who we thought we were have been stripped away. Burnt up as dross. I hope that makes sense, and maybe you have experience of it. So, it's so funny, Eddie Furlong. Have you seen this boy? I love Terminator 2. Well, we're going to talk about horoscopes for each of your rising signs for this fun little event. You see, Pluto's going to remain in Capricorn until January 20th of next year. So we have a good chunk of time for reflection. So we look at the houses here, and we should be able to see the area of life in which we've been shattered since 2008, indicated by the house. So let's go through each rising sign then, shall we? We're going to start off with Aries. Aries rising. So dear Aries here, we have the 10th house. Pluto is re-entering your 10th house. That means you've probably been dealing with a complete change in life direction since 2008, right? The path you were on was shattered in front of you over the subsequent 7 years. I'm saying 7 years because it's roughly like 15 years between then and now. And if we divide that up into sevens, because I like 7, the first half of that is having the path ripped away from you. Then the second 7, the next 7 years, are an agonizing reappraisal. It leads us to new directions quite frequently, but it can be quite painful because we let go of everything we once knew and held dear. And this leads back to the 11th house of our ideals and our aspirations and our interests. But that change in life direction will also prompt a change in these. Now let's move to Taurus rising. So Taurus rising, that means your 9th house here. Pluto has gone back into your 9th house. So you've been dealing with a complete change in your worldview and what you believe. Your sense of understanding, philosophy, ideology was perhaps shattered since, 2008. I mean, that was a wild time for all of us, wasn't it? For those of you who are around. So again, the 7 years. It was likely followed by a sense of bewilderment, seeking the truth and finding perhaps a spiritual practice or ideal that more fits who you are becoming. This leads back to the 10th house, where our life direction changes because of the internal changes, the reflection that happens within the 9th house. We put our realizations into practice in the 10th house. Well, how about our dear Gemini risings? So our dear Gemini risings, that means Pluto has just re-entered the 8th house. And remember, we're readdressing these topics. We're hammering nails in the coffin of that. Ooh, I hit myself in the face, of that house. And again, Pluto is death, isn't he? So Oh, Gemini, I'm so sorry. Eighth house. So you've been dealing with a complete change in how you approach fear, death, and managing resources. The eighth house is death, fear, and other people's stuff. Oftentimes, you're probably forced to face terrifying situations. They could be situations no bigger than, giving a talk or a speech or whatever, but they would be absolutely terrifying to you. And, it's not life-threatening, but it could feel life-threatening and feel like our lives are at stake, in this whole thing. And we make mountains out of molehills, or they really could be severe circumstances, but it's the way they feel, the subjective experience of it. Our sense of morality. I'm so sorry. Mortality. Our sense of mortality, the reality of life and death, actually become real in our consciousness. We feel it in our bones, the inevitability of such, and the fact that our very being, rather our bodies, our thoughts, our emotions, not necessarily being, but that it's always fleeting. It's always passing away, immediately as it arises. In fact, some Buddhists would say nothing has ever even arisen. Other thing. So, the other thing about this is people may have been able to manipulate you with money or things, because it's other people's stuff. People get to try and make you do what they want you to do by holding a carrot in front of you. But hopefully you've likely learned some lessons and you're less easily manipulated. Now, we're moving to the ninth house, you see? You've faced your fears in the eighth house, and then we reflect on what it all means. Let's go to Cancer rising, and we've got the seventh house. Pluto has just entered your seventh house, Capricorn rising. That means you've been dealing with a major shift in how you approach relationships. Perhaps you've had long stints alone, dealt with narcissistic or abusive partners. But be ready for disruptions. They will probably be about things you thought were over, right? These are revisiting, readdressing. But again, it could be the nail put in a coffin of a destructive relationship, something that hasn't served you. Maybe it was something to do with divorce. But either way, you're prompted to face those parts of yourself that it's not necessarily submissive, but the parts of ourselves that prompt us to need someone else. If that makes sense. As Pluto passes through the seventh house, oftentimes we really have to face our own sense of codependency, or the opposite side, where we're the controlling people in a relationship. Two sides of the same coin. Here, remember this line from the Labyrinth? You have no power over me. That also means you don't really have power over anyone else. The only person you should ever have power over is not me, but you, over yourself. Let's go on to Leo in the sixth house here, shall we? So Leo, you've probably been dealing with a major shift in how you approach health, conflict, obligations. Life may feel destabilizing here. Like there's little room for consistency. It probably feels like there's so much to do and you're overwhelmed. Maybe you've had a disruptive injury or illness that wrecked your routine and your sense of normalcy. Oftentimes this prompts us to streamline our lives, to live lightly with fewer obligations. And we're moving back to the seventh house here. So after we're challenged on responsibility, then we're challenged on how we relate to others. How about Virgo here? Virgo. The Virgo's out, the jig is up. They finally found me. The jig is up. They finally found me. A renegade who had it made. Anyway, that sticks, but. So Virgo, this is the 5th house, you see. You've been dealing with a complete change in your approach to children and pleasure. Maybe you never wanted children and they just happened, you know. Maybe you always wanted children and found out you couldn't have them or there was some complication. Maybe you were just a super serious person for a long time and you're forced to reckon with having to have fun or finding some sort of outlet, because if you're forcing yourself into endless obligations all the time, life not only gets tedious, but joyless. Can lead to terrible depression and a sense of meaninglessness. So, we get prompted to learn to have fun. Now, pleasure is okay here. Within reason, you don't want to hurt anyone. But pleasure is okay because then, now this is 20 years from now, but Pluto will go back into the 6th house. Wait. No. Anyway. Pluto is going back into the 6th house in January. I'm so sorry. I was talking about Pluto exiting Aquarius, which is 20 years after. But Pluto will re-enter your 6th house in January, and that's where we are challenged to get back onto the responsibility kick. So let's go to Libra rising now. So for Libra rising, right, this is the 4th house. You've probably suffered a loss, perhaps of a parent, maybe property, a living situation. You may have found out new or disturbing information about your origins. Maybe you were, I hate to say this, but, maybe you had a hidden parent you weren't aware of. Like, Darth Vader's really your father. Something like that. Being adopted isn't a bad thing, but finding out all of a sudden, like, oh my gosh, I didn't know. Or finding something, they do those like genealogy things on KPBS or whatever, public television. And, some dude would find out that one of his ancestors was a racist or something crazy, and they'd be like, no. I mean, that kind of revelation. 23andMe stuff, like, I found out I had, a nasty gene that I don't want from 23andMe, that kind of revelation. Oh my goodness, my ancestors were assholes. Your attachment or relationship to your country or your patriotism could become contentious. The 4th house is also the motherland, right? Our origins. You could have a big disruptive move. But remember, this is going eventually to the 5th house again, where our focus goes from our past to our progeny. Let's move on now to Scorpio rising. And this is the 3rd house here. So you've been dealing with big upheavals in your immediate community, perhaps your education or writing ability, speaking, whatever. Or it could be siblings and extended family. You may have found yourself becoming a debate lord, perhaps. Well, that's an ad hominem fallacy. That's a fallacious argument. That's appeal to authority, or that's appeal to empathy or emotion. Like, just watch Tim Pool. Oh, that's an appeal to this. My banana's appealing. Anyway. So, find yourself becoming aggressive in speech and writing. Like... Karen stuff. Or, all those jerks on social media. We see the need to dominate through speech or conflicts, perhaps with locals or neighbors. Think of disputes with neighbors and people on the road. But this is a long, long thing, you see. So there could also be feuds or fights with siblings or extended family, because the 3rd house is not just siblings, but also aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever. And we're moving back to the 4th house here. So we go from the concern for our community to the concern with where we came from, with our situation, with our own security and safety. Now let's go to Sagittarius. And this is the second house. So that means you've probably been dealing with a major upheaval and how you get your livelihood, money, and basic sustenance or resources. You probably experienced big financial ups and downs, right, over the past 15 years or so. You may have had a tendency to hoard wealth and save. Your relationship to stuff or material possessions is challenged. And then we get the motivation oftentimes through the sense of being overwhelmed, often severely. We get the impulse to streamline our lives from that, just like we mentioned in the 6th house, having to streamline our obligations. Here it's about streamlining our stuff. How much do you really need? How are you using your resources? That's a very 8th house thing too. But you see, the 2nd house is your own stuff, what you earn and produce. While the 8th house, it's like unearned income, like investments and taxes, debt, things that other people give you. So remember, we're moving back to the 3rd house here too, where we go from focus on what we value to community values. Well, how about Capricorn? Oh, I still had it left in. We talked about Sagittarius. There's Sagittarius. Now we're in Capricorn rising, where Pluto re-entered the 1st house. Well, you've probably been dealing with a complete shattering of who you are. Your feeling of yourself even changes. The experience of yourself, your sense of being an individual. It has probably felt like a death of sorts. You may not even relate to memories of yourself. I was looking at photos of myself the other day. Pluto just went into my 1st house, and I'm Aquarius rising, so I was looking at photos of myself, old photos, and like, wow, I know that's me, but it's not me. It's a very interesting thing. But you would know, Capricorn rising, because you've been dealing with this for a while. Our appearance changes, yes, but so does the soul. If you believe in a soul, whatever we call soul, that sense of whatever makes you you. I prefer the term consciousness. The things we hold dear, as I said in another segment, were stripped away. But this is parts of ourselves that are stripped away, or what we think is ourselves, what we take ourselves to be. My computer is so loud now. I should show you what my computer looks like. This is my new computer, and my video quality is getting so much better. I mean, like, I don't know about me, my quality, but I mean the quality of the actual video. Did it come back on here? Okay, yeah, there we go. So, what's going on here, my dear Capricorn rising, is you're closing the door on this phase of your life. You're going back into the 1st house to readdress those last little bit of threads, those uncertainties of self that still linger from the last phase, the last cycle. So you see, you will be dealing with this for a few months here. And then in January, you go back into the 2nd house when it goes from addressing who we are to what we want. Now we come to me, Aquarius rising. Oops, went too far. So, Aquarius risings, the 12th house. The 12th house is hard. We are addressing, or readdressing rather, issues with our mental health. Over the past however many years, we've been facing mental health issues, self-defeating habits or destructive ones, isolation and seclusion. Perhaps we found doctors or got on treatment plans for mental illness or addiction. Again, like I said, self-defeating habits. We need to address these issues. Again, like substance abuse or mental health breakdowns, mental health crises. And sometimes crises are just a climax to a longer undercurrent that's going on. We'll often see Saturn, moon aspects in natal charts, like hard aspects, indicating some of these mental challenges. We're being forced into seclusion oftentimes, and we're reassessing the progress that we've made. And then we get tested on that. Can we handle these challenging circumstances that years ago would have caused us to drown or have a major crisis? Are we able to watch and notice and actually realize the progress we've made? We're going from the 12th house of self-destruction to the first house of self-creation. Well, how about dear Pisces here? Well, my dear Pisces, the 11th house, that's your hopes, your aspirations, your dreams and associations. All these things have been put through a major threshing over the past 15 years or so. Old friends may have become harmful influences. You may have had to leave them all behind. Maybe they were doing self-destructive things that didn't fit you anymore. It may feel like it's hard to tell who your allies are and who's secretly working against you. It's easy to become very suspicious during this whole thing. Your interests, what you're interested in, which also determines who you're friends with, what your goals are. All these things are going to go through their own threshing, their own distillation process, their own refining. And the thing about refining and refinement, you think about smelting steel, right? Molten hot magma. Sorry, Dr. Evil. My magma. Anyway. It takes extreme heat and pressure to refine things. And so that gives us an indication as to this whole symbolism of the alchemical wedding that we go through in the quest to realize who and what we are. But you see, that's a whole nother video for another time. I think my computer's been very loud this whole time, so I apologize for that. But we'll see how this turns out. So thank you for watching all the way to the end. I hope some of this stuff is useful and interesting. And remember that I do wonderful readings. All my information is below in the video description. And have a wonderful whatever you're having. I love you so much. Mwah.